Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Therapist Connect broadcast. Today is one of our Lifetime Achievement interviews, and we're absolutely delighted to be interviewing Sheila Haugh. Hello, Sheila.
Hiya.
It's great to have you here. Sheila has worked as a counsellor and therapist and supervisor for over 40 years. This has been in lots of different settings, including drugs and alcohol work, working with victims and survivors of domestic abuse, and working with the dying and bereaved. She's maintained a private practice for most of this time, as well as working in various other organisational settings. Sheila has also worked as a senior lecturer in counselling and psychotherapy at Leeds Metropolitan University, now Leeds Beckett, including programme leader for both the MA in Client-Centred Psychotherapy and the MA in Psychological Therapies. Sheila was previous board member of the World Association for Person-Centered and Experiential Psychotherapy, as well as a long-term chair of the British Association for the Person-Centered Approach, where she received an honorary membership in recognition of her services to the association and the Person-Centered Approach in Great Britain. She's been a facilitator on several national and international person-centered encounter groups and meetings, and presented at the Czech and Slovak Person-Centered Institute's international annual meetings. She's written many book chapters and contributed to many person-centered texts over the years, and she's currently Director of Studies for the Diploma/MSc in Contemporary Person-Centered Psychotherapy and Applications at Metanoia Institute, and also my boss. And I'm
the last bit's the best.
So I've got to be careful what I say today. So I'm sure everyone would agree there is a significant amount of work and contributions there that you've made to the field of counselling and psychotherapy, as well as the person-centered community. So Sheila, welcome to this interview, which is well deserved. How are you today?
I'm good. I've got a slight feeling of being on desert island discs at the moment. So let's check what is.
We could do that as one of the questions. We could see which
wow. Oh my God.
Would you bring with you? Yeah. Have a think about it. We've got a set of questions to kind of go through today and have a little bit of a chat about your career, but I suppose like an obvious one is what actually drew you to therapy in the first place as a profession, or person-centered therapy, I suppose, specifically.
Well, when you and I were first talking about this meeting, and that is that you'd start off with something like that, I was trying to think of, when I was thinking about it, it was quite strange because the initial answer is nothing drew me. I sort of found myself in it and fell into it. I've always been a bit envious of those people who knew from a really early age what they wanted to do. And I had the usual, rock star, which I haven't actually given up on yet, although it's looking a little bit unlikely these days, and some other things. But I'd started off wanting to do drama and dance, and for various reasons that didn't work out. I happened to meet someone who became a life partner, who was working in adventure playgrounds, and I was lost. I didn't know what to do. I'd had to leave dance school because of a bad back, and he was working on what then were called, as I say, adventure playgrounds in London, and seemed to be having an awful lot of fun in Shepherd's Bush, running around building things. And I thought I quite fancied doing that, but I couldn't get a job because I had no experience, and I was 19, I think. And between a long story short, I ended up getting a job under a government job creation scheme in a youth club, and it just sort of came from there. I then was on a scheme with Haringey Council and worked, and you got placed, and I spent 12 months at that youth club, which was a tough youth club, and I spent 18 months working in a centre for young people, like I was old, at risk of coming into contact with the courts or in contact with the courts. And it's like the council put me in there, and I got to know the work there, and I started sort of like I was a sort of like peripatetic, you can talk to me person, and it was very low key, obviously, but I think that was it. And then the next bit for me was all these young people hated their social workers. I mean, almost to a person as I remember it. And I got this idea in my head about, because I'd been coming from a youth work background in terms of adventure playgrounds and the youth club. And I got it into my head about trying to bring youth work and social work together, because I knew the social workers were doing their best. So I did a social work qualification, and about 6 months into that, I knew I wasn't going to do social work. Came out and managed to get a job in a counselling service, a youth counselling service in Earls Court, and it just took off from there, really, if I can put it like it took off. In those times, you could be employed as a counsellor in a project like that, and I'd had a social work qualification with a couple of days skills practice. But that's how it was then. It was a bit more, a bit freer, I think, in some ways. So that's how I got there into this field. And the person-centered bit.
Yeah. When did that come in?
Well, that was also chance. And I'd forgotten this bit until you asked. We were talking about this. ILEA was the Inner London Education Authority, and it's way gone thanks to Thatcher. But their youth service was quite extensive. And if you ever want to ask me what I think the problem is for some young people these days, it goes back to basically wiping out the youth service, both in London and outside London. They set up the youth office set up something called, it was a new approach to research called illuminative research. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, Peter. It's because it is quite a long time ago, and I understand from this morning you might not have been born at this point. So so I signed up to do that because it's, and I came into contact with a woman in the ILEA called Irene Fairhurst. And she happened to say one day they were bringing this guy over called Carl Rogers. I like the way this illuminative work, and the people involved in it. It was very collaborative type of research, and looking at how it was as simple as looking how it was for people using the youth service, young people. And she happened to mention another part of her work. They were bringing over a guy called Carl Rogers, who I vaguely remembered from my social work training. And he was doing a day in London for youth workers. Would I like to go? Between the jigs and the reels, I didn't get to go. But I came into contact with Irene and these other people. And they were running a course and said, would I like to come on their course? I couldn't that year, and then had to wait 3 years to go on the course. So is the word happenstance that I came into contact with Irene Fairhurst in particular. And that's when I got into person-centered.
So, I mean, there's lots of different influences there, isn't it? And a nearly meeting with Carl Rogers.
A nearly meeting with Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was also supposed to be the facilitator. My training was all my training in what was called then Client-Centred Psychotherapy was all residential. And we did something like 5 9-day residentials, and over 2.5 years, and 5 residential weekends over that 2.5 years. So it's quite intense. And he was supposed to be one of the facilitators on my first residential. But he died the February before. And I mean, I tell this story often, I have real mixed feelings about that, because I didn't meet Carl Rogers. So, hey. And a lot of people, many people who've met him have always said he was quite quietly charismatic. He wasn't one of those stand-up people, but people were drawn to him. And he seems to be mostly, I mean, nobody's liked by everybody, but many, many people seem to really like him. And my husband, current husband, I don't know if that's quite the right way to put it, but my husband worked with him a little bit. And So I'm sad I didn't get to meet him. On the other hand, I fell in love with the work, the thinking, the philosophy, rather than the one individual. So I've always felt a bit mixed about that. The other advantage of not getting onto that course that year was I decided I needed to do something in between. So I did a course, it was called something like a certificate in psychodynamic counselling, something like that. And that was very much a taught sitting lecture room for 2 semesters. And then the last one was a practice. I loved the first 2 semesters. I really got into theory. I don't know if I can't remember if I liked the theory, but I loved trying to work it out, which surprised me. I didn't think I'd ever been a theory person. But within 10 minutes of the first practice semester, I knew it wasn't for me. It was like it was done deal. It's like, no, I don't want to work with people like this. I don't want to talk about, I can't present someone I've worked with to a group of 8 people and feel okay while they tell me about this person. And I appreciate, this is not to diss psychoanalytic or psychodynamic work. We were newbies, so our conversation was not very, very deep or profound, but just heartfelt. No, not for me.
So early on, you were drawn to the person-centered approach and kind of what it was, and it's interesting to hear you say that you didn't feel like you were a theory person, because I very much see you as a theory person these days, particularly around obviously the person-centered approach and understanding it. So did that continue from that point, like being interested in theory, or did that take some time to develop?
Oh, that took a lot of time to develop. I was really engaged by those theory seminars, but then it's like, I would say I wasn't terribly interested, and I wasn't terribly interested in person-centered theory. The residential program for me, I used to think the program for me was majority it was experiencing, being together in a group. We would have an encounter, a 2-hour encounter group, pretty much every day we've ever met. And sometimes I wonder what did we talk about? But we did. They were brilliant. They were profound. They were moving. Some of us loved them. Some of us hated them. Sometimes they were quite. You can imagine living with people for 9 days. And those were the days. I really hate it when I say that, but this is part of it. We didn't have mobile phones, so we couldn't phone home. And we used to queue for the one telephone box in the residential unit. So you were in it. So that's what, and then but I used to say, well, I still say it, my love of person-centered theory was absolutely developed through a guy called Chuck Devonshire. And Chuck Devonshire was a colleague of Rogers, and Rogers and Chuck Devonshire and Alberto Zucconi, who's still with us, I think, they set up something called the International IPCL International Institute of Persons. No, that was ours. I don't know. I can't remember the name. It's so long ago. But they set it up an international training group, of which they moved around Europe, and they managed to get quite a lot of learning programs, of which the Great Britain one, with Irene Fairhurst and Tony Mary, was one. And he used to do what I remember. I wonder what other people remember on that course. But they ended up being called Chuckettes. And every morning he'd come downstairs and he would, whatever was on his mind that day. It was quite we didn't always get a choice, but whatever was on his mind, theoretically, he would just talk through. And we could ask questions, and it would be half an hour or an hour or break. And I just started to really, really enjoy his Chuckettes, and then realizing I was learning theory. And so I ascribe my love of theory to that bloke. That's where it developed. For me personally, it was really engaging.
I'm thinking about that difference of like reading about theory and then that engagement with it, like that discussion, and making it kind of come alive and actually making it, I suppose, a bit more interesting and tangible, possibly.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, because I think we, you know, often in the encounter groups, for example, it was usually facilitated by two members of the training group, and then we would get feedback on our facilitation after with links to theory. That was all part of the deal. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It was a really strong, and we had the time and the space. You know, literally the only thing in organising us was lunchtime and dinner time that was served by others, so we needed to be there. So, you know, we didn't have home times, so we had a lot of space. Yeah.
I'm thinking as you're describing that, it makes sense to me a little bit about how you engage with encounter groups. You always want them to kind of go on longer and kind of get as much out of them as possible. It just reminds me how you describe
that's true.
those kind of,
yeah.
So that was kind of the beginnings, I suppose. But are you able to tell us a little bit about your career so far, then, and how that's progressed from that point? Because you've done a lot in the last 40 years.
Yeah, I was a bit. It was like when you were reading all. I mean, I wrote that, of course, or different blogs, like, you know, bios like that. But when you were reading it, it was like, bloody hell. Ooh, I don't know. It says, oh dear, oh dear. I thought that's a bit of a shock, because I don't know how it progressed. Actually, I really don't know. I have quite a. I have an interest. I've been called ambitious by some people, and I react against that. But maybe I do have some ambitions, but not usually, I think, in getting somewhere. And I don't know if that's my gender identification issue, or just who I am, but so how it progressed, I don't know. Some of it, I would say, I think one of the big shifts in my working life was when I started working with dying people and people working with dying people and friends and colleagues and family of dying people. And that came about just because of where I was. I was working in Earls Court in West London in 1981. This was in the youth counselling service. And the youth counsellor was working with homeless young people. And Earls Court was there was a sort of the Earls Court and West End part of London that brought young people in. I keep saying people because we were all the same age at that point. There wasn't that much difference. And it was there, you know, part of my work there was there for the grace of God. I'd left Liverpool, because there was Liverpool for me at that point. There was no work, didn't feel any prospects. So I was one of those people who sort of migrated to London. And then some of the people we were working with started getting ill and were ending up at St. Stephen's, which became up in Chelsea and Fulham. And of course, with hindsight, you know, that the St. Stephen's became a centre of excellence around HIV and AIDS before HIV was actually identified. And some of the people we were working with were getting ill, and some of them were dying. And, you know, there was a lot of the sex industry around Earls Court. And we were working equally with young men and young women at that point. And then when the HIV was discovered, myself and a colleague, we had a woman called Magella McElwee, who worked up at St. Stephen's in the sexual health. And she was on a sort of afternoon secondment in our project so that people would get to know her. So they needed to go to the sexual health It was a link, it was a way in. And she was being asked to do quite a lot of training around HIV and health. It was all around health and safety. And the head of there was a guy at Hammersmith and Fulham, which was the borough in the UK that took the first wave of HIV and AIDS, and London Lighthouse was being built there. And we started being asked to do training, and a group of us got together, and eventually Magella and I set up a training organisation, but it just seemed quite organic, really, in terms of we ran our training. We worked together as a partnership for about 6-7 years, doing training around death and dying, safer sex, health and safety. It's like sort of, so it was a real, and it was a chaotic time. It was a really grueling time. It was a creative time. It was, but it was sort of like, you know, in the right place at the wrong time, or in the wrong place at the right time, or, you know, I don't want, it just happened to be there and it grew. So, and that was while I was doing my training in client-centered psychotherapy. And I think the two really went together, because it was just like, you know, one way or t'other, I'd always been taught, and I think that's our cultural imperative, to do. And what do you do when someone's dying? You know, what do you do when their family won't be around them? I mean, you can't do anything. And I remember Magella saying something along the lines of, and I'll leave out the swear words, but I remember Magella doing something like, she said something like, you know, I love Kubler-Ross's work. I love it, but it doesn't tell me what I do next. And, you know, for both of us, Rogers, I mean, I'm speaking for her many years on, but Rogers just gave some grounding. Actually, it's, you know, to be finding your way of being and communicating that's what you do. And it was such profound work sometimes that, you know, it never crossed my mind there'd be another way of doing it. So that, I think that was a major, you know, that happened in my lifetime at that point in my lifetime. So I guess that was a major shift somewhere. And I don't really know about the rest. Just sort of followed my nose a bit.
Well, that's thinking when you were talking, almost like I was getting a sense there wasn't like this big plan necessarily of where you wanted to go, but as kind of things arrived, or people you connected with, or kind of roles and things kind of progressed from there, where you kind of took on or built something from what was good because of what was going on around you at the time.
Yeah, and I think it's really, really important for me, and I do say this to others, I've always been lucky enough, and it started from that training in client-centered therapy with Irene Fairhurst, Tony Merry, and at that point a guy called Dave Buck. Dave Buck left for various reasons. But, you know, I started off with those, and Magella McElwee and Stephen Debrett and a couple of, you know, I've always had or always been in some group of, like with you now and the team at Metanoia on the Masters, that actually I've always been involved. I've always been quite close in doing that. And I think that's what's held me, that's what's sustained me, that's what keeps me going. I am sort of the opinion, maybe this is a bit too extreme, but I don't know how easy it is, and it would have been impossible for me to stay with classical, to stay within this way of being, if I hadn't I don't want to say people around me as on the centre, but hadn't been in those groups. Because I still think to this day that person-centered psychotherapy, as I understand it, is deeply radical. And it's really difficult to hold it if you're on your own.
I think that's really interesting. I was just thinking about, so Therapists Connect, all the different therapists that I've connected with, some person-centered, some not. But a lot of them talk about how isolating it can be, just in general, being a therapist, and then keeping yourself grounded in a specific approach. If you're not in those communities, then maybe that is even more challenging to kind of
absolutely.
You know, because you're isolated, you're not connected with other people, and constantly, I was going to say not developing, that's not the word, but sustaining maybe your person-centered practice. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure it's happened to many person-centered therapists, you know, or people who are in the approach who ascribed the approach, is, you know, sometimes I say something to me that seems like the bleeding obvious, and some people will know, you know, one day I'll write that book called The Bleeding Obvious. The trouble is, it's a bit boring because, of course, you read it and it's bleeding obvious. So why would you read it? But I got a present from a group one time, and they bought me a notebook, and on the front it said The Bleeding Obvious, and I still have that book. It's great. And I've forgotten what I was going to say. What were you saying about the
sustaining your practice?
No, it's gone. It's gone. It'll come back if it's meaningful.
What aspect of your career are you most proud of?
I have thought about this question already, and I still don't quite have an answer. This is not. What am I most proud of? I don't know. I'm really happy with all of it. I don't know. Maybe I need to go back into therapy and think this one through. But proud's not. I don't really have I have moments of pride about what people are doing, but for myself, I'm just happy. I'm more or less happy. You know, I still want to be a rock star. That is a profound sadness. Yeah, and I look at Chrissy Hines and think it's not too late, Sheila. But what am I? No, I don't know. I don't know, Peter. I don't know. I can tell you things I've really liked.
Yeah.
I do really like. Okay, what I really like is I think I've been able to, despite pressure, it feels like, what comes to my mind now is, you know, I don't get caught up in person-centered theory having to explain everything. You know, what about when you work with this, and what about when you work with that? And that's when I see some of us slip. We start getting into a bit of a well. But actually in my heart, it's like the answer's all the same. Yeah, I'll stop on that one because I don't know.
Yeah. For me, I've just listened to you, that it reminds me of, for me, thinking about person-centered theory, like how simple it is.
Yeah.
But how actually a lot of people often perceive that to be, meaning it lacks nuance and depth, and also complication to it as well.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes, I mean, sadly, I think there are a lot of people who understand or don't understand the profundity of it. Someone said to me, I was talking about a way of responding to a client at one point, and somebody said, well, that means you're pluralistic. And it was like, oh, okay, I get where you're coming from on this, why that sounds pluralistic. But I think it's coming from such a different place that I can't perceive it as pluralistic. And I think for me, Peter, that's an example of this. You know, we take 4 years of training and a year of research on our programme and we never finish. I mean, us and the students never finish that bit of what is empathy, what's congruence, what's UPR, that I do not want to call UPR anymore. So that's I'm anticipating my next steps. I'll wait till you ask me that question. But yeah, it's never ending. It's never ending. I mean, it's actually like Gendlin's work, and it's, you know, Gendlin and the sort of, we can always be more. And I have a sense with person, we can always be deeper. It's never ending. I don't know if that sounds a bit twee or a bit precious, but hey, that's how it is to me.
That really resonates with me, because sometimes there's a perception, I think, within the therapy community that, oh, we all do person-centered, like we all have those core conditions, and therefore that's person-centered. What else are you then doing? Whereas what you're talking about is the flip side of that, which is actually to embody those 6 conditions, there is a constant process of
Yes. Yeah.
of reflection, because they're different in different relationships,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah,
constant work. Yeah.
I just remembered what I'd forgotten before.
The
And it
bleeding
is
obvious.
something, it's part of the bleeding of, yes, exactly. Because it's something about, you know, those times that I will say something that to me is absolutely, I mean, it's so obvious, I don't even, I'm really surprised when anybody says, what do you mean? It's like, and I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And I think it is linked to that bit about how complicated Roger's work is actually, but how simple it is. It's the absolute quantum paradox for me, or one of the theories about. I mean, I always think, and I often use that example of energy equals mc squared. I hope that's the right one, you know, of Einstein. And there it is, and it's beautiful, and it's formed, and it's everybody. Apparently all the scientists loved it, you know, and there are years and years of work and lots of whiteboards and blackboards and chalkboards and everything behind that little statement. I think it's true of a lot of theories. This is not just Rogers, of course, but for some reason Rogers seems to get or person-centered theory seems to attract that. You know, if there it is, and there it is, that's it. And forgetting the years and all the PhD students and all the research projects that went into those 6, you know, I mean, and even the 1959 paper, which is, you know, a struggle to get through, is, you know, being criticized by some as the if-then equation. But that paper took 4 or 5 years to write. Yeah. It's like, it's beyond, I don't know how many people write a paper taking 4 or 5 years anymore. Maybe, I'm sure there are people out there, but, you know, we get a timeline of 12 months.
And all of that came before it to build into that, but then all that has gone since as well, yes. You know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Added or critiqued or developed in different ways.
Yeah.
Just shifting the topic slightly, I was just wondering, how has the profession changed since you qualified as a therapist, or since you started working as a therapist?
Oh, Peter, where do I start?
Wherever you wish.
Obviously, it is much more regulated than it was. It's much more defined than it was. And I feel very ambivalent about all that. And I feel like it's funny when you're saying what you're proud of, it's also what I'm not sure about, actually thinking about it, which is why I can't just pride on it. So, you know, we now have UKCP registered person-centered training. I think there's 2 in the, I think there's myself has done that, and Sherwood, I think. And I think there might be another one, but I'm not sure about that. We have hundreds, maybe, it's exaggeration, of BACP courses, person-centered courses, but I'm not sure how much that has helped either person-centered or therapy generally, but I was part of it. I was part of one of the first UKCP ones. I was part of one of the first BACP. I think the Institute of Person-Centered Learning, when we were working together, myself with the others, I think that was only the second BACP accredited person-centered course in the country after Strathclyde with Dave Mearns. So that's changed. We're much more regulated, and I think we're a lot more. Oh God, I mean, there's just so many things that you should do and you shouldn't do now, and there seems to be coming into. I was hearing of a person-centered therapist recently, who in you know, the first appointment with their counsellor, and I'm sorry if anybody's listening and this is what you do, but you know, there was a whole question about, have you ever thought of committing suicide? Are you, you know, it was like this interview, which even 10 years ago, I'm not sure, would have been part of the picture of when you first meet a client. So that's really, really changed. And I think the definition of therapy, or what people think therapy, this bit's not a criticism, it's an observation, what people think is therapy has changed very profoundly. And so it's much more, I think as therapists, I get a feeling we're more scared as well of being free or being just with someone. I'm really taken by some of Nick Totten's work about wild therapy, which originally I thought meant walking in the wild, because I'm a bit literal about things like that. I have to really sort of stop and hear what people ask other people. Does it mean walking in the streets or walking in the countryside? But that for him was about being wild inside, that we've become domesticated as therapists. And I believe that. Now, I think most of the time it has been for the best intentions. It's like, we've not gone out of our way to be daft, protecting clients. And, there's a real power issue. And the sort of when the cultural issues are now much more part of things, which I think for me it always was, but maybe always a bit weakly. So, power in the therapeutic relationship really does bring in some of these issues and how we work. But there's been a cost that somehow we've forgotten about the relationship. The therapeutic relationship seems to have come incredibly, it's not circumcised, is it? But something, what's the word, when it's like, this is what the therapeutic relationship is. And that's how it's going to be. And you have to do A, B, C, and D, and and there's all these things, and then you can do the work, or something like that. I'm exaggerating, I know, but in behavior I might be exaggerating, but I'm not sure sometimes in how we are being taught, and maybe you and I are part of this as well, how to view therapy. I do talk about therapy being, for me, it's a sacred space that I'm trying to clear for me, get me out of the way. Excuse me. It's a sacred space, but it seems to be in a sacred space that's boxed in now rather than fluid.
It's interesting because when you were talking, I was getting this sense of it sounded like you were talking about, you felt things were becoming narrower and more restricted rather than an opening up of possibilities, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not convinced at all, and I know many people disagree with this, but I'm not convinced at all regulation helps. I always throw out Shipman. Shipman managed to end the lives of many, many people. And the medical profession is very, very, it's regulated.
Yeah, that sense of does it actually keep people safe, or does it just make us feel like we are keeping people safe?
Yeah. And I don't know, I really don't know how to address this, keep coming back to this issue, how it is so hard for people to complain anyway. And how often, because people feel, you have to stand up and put your profound pain in public. It's really easy. The couple of times in my life that I haven't complained about something that's happened to me has been like, I don't have the energy to do this as well as that. So I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to this bit. And people feeling that maybe their careers might be affected if they make any complaints about something. When we hear about practice we don't like and we can't do anything. I think these are really difficult areas that are sometimes not sure how much as I'm talking, I'm not sure how often we actually talk about them or air them. There's some, I don't know that there's any answers, but as you know, Peter, I'm quite into this idea of configuration now. Let's get together and talk about this. I don't think we'll get any answers necessarily, but the configuration of what's going on here that helps us move, maybe that's part of that openness, that fluidity you picked up on as well.
And that sense of, at least if we're talking about it, there may be something that comes from that. There may be a resolution or a change or a shift or a maybe not an answer, but a progression somewhere. Yeah.
Well, I have this profound belief that if, I mean, I've got some caveats to this. This is not like, I don't think do not believe I'm being Pollyanna about this, because there's situations in the world that I'm not sure meet this, will do this. But in this context, I really do think if you can get together, it's not only that you find, people seem to worry about a compromise or, somebody has to lose, somebody has to win or something like that. I think sometimes in some of the groups I've been, something absolutely, and this is why I like quantum theory, something absolutely new has emerged that none of us had thought of. It's not a combination of everything, or you said, okay, it's brand new. So that's where I like the idea of getting together. That's maybe part of why I'm quite into this idea of let's have a configuration meeting, because I don't know what else to call it. Because while you're configuring and not fighting, I'm exaggerating again, but something absolutely brand new. It's the idea of complexity theory, something new that's never been there before, suddenly appears, emerges. So I wish we had time
through relationship.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love that. You've written a lot about person-centered therapy, and I know you'd say that you haven't written a lot, but you have written a lot.
Okay.
Okay. What motivates you to write about it?
If I'm God's honest truth, quite often it's because I'm asked.
Mm-hmm.
It's but partly that's because I'm not, I think you said sometime about saying to groups you're working with, look, this is my ideal I'm telling you here, not necessarily what I did. And I think that because, when I say this, it's like I am so, maybe I shouldn't, well, I mean, those people who've worked with me writing know this anyway. I need deadlines and I'm not great with deadlines. So, writing my own, just off the top of my own head is like, manana. But actually the saying yes is, a little bit of arrogance, I guess. I do know this, I can write this. Now I believe, I feel I can write things, even I know my process is going through, I can't, but I acknowledge I can. And something about, there's a lot of, I identify as classical, with a leaning towards experiential. And it always seems to me that at the moment and in the last 10 years, there's not a lot of stuff going on classically. There's quite a bit. It's not like there's nothing, because I don't want to, people like, some of the things I've read of David Murphy, Peter Schmidt, it's around, so it's not that, but on the ground in Britain, because I think we have quite a different environment to continental Europe and America, and have quite a different type of person-centeredness here. So there's something about wanting to hold the depth of it, wanting to prolong a conversation rather than 150 words on Twitter, or something like that, of which I feel there's a lot out there at the moment, and it usually seems to get a bit iffy. There's something about, okay, let's sit down and really try and think about this, and that. So I think that's part of the motivation. If I think about it and someone disagrees, then we can dialogue. But if I haven't thought about it, then we just, that's going to be, it's just, I can't think, it's a bit blah, blah.
So it sounds like to me part of that writing process, like the motivation is to push things to depth, like to develop the conversation or the discussion through your writing process.
Yeah. And actually, of course, it still hacks me off sometimes. I learn stuff. It does actually make me read the latest papers. It does actually make me look, when someone says, a paper I just finished, your references on research need to be a bit more recent. It's like, oh, okay. And so I do, and it feeds itself. It really feeds itself.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting because you were talking, I was making me think about students with assignments and kind of seeing a shift and change where some people might not really want to read, anymore, and they're kind of like, oh no, I know it. But then when they push themselves and actually start to read more widely, and actually that then improves their practice, you see kind of light bulb moments where people go, that's what it means, or that's what that is, so
I think it's such an irritating process that I actually learned from writing this. And I remember when I did my master's at Regents, which wasn't person-centered, it used to just really hack me off how much I learned writing those essays. I haven't got over being hacked off by that.
I think it's great because students can watch this and know that it doesn't stop. You can just keep going with it.
Some things you never work through. Just be bitter to the end.
Have you got a favourite piece of writing from, not your own piece of writing, but from other authors?
My favourite piece of writing is, my favourite books are Tony Merry's. That's I just think he was just so pragmatic in many ways. So I know some people are not that fussed on it, but what is it? There's no person who's ever a happy person to everybody. That's not quite good English. I do like his writings. I like Peter Schmidt's writings, and I was lucky enough, or it was fortuitous enough, that when I was quite early doors in my writing career, I edited the empathy book, of which Peter Schmidt had a paper. And because I was the editor, one of the editors with Tony, I was helping with the English. Now, those of you who've read Peter Schmidt know how precise that man was with his wording. And so I had to keep going back. It took me about 4 or 5 days, really close reading, writing out notes and checking with him and getting told. I remember writing to him saying, you've used the word impressed here. In English, that sort of means, oh, I'm really impressed with that, so you might want to change it. And he wrote back saying, no, because impressed means I have an impression. There's an impression being made on me. It's like, oh, okay. But what that experience of having to do that, I personally find his papers quite easy to read now, but it was just luck. But so I've loved his papers, and I've loved following through. He was described as our sort of the person-centered philosopher, but actually when you follow through, you see these philosophies all over the place. So I think he brought it into our approach, but he was synthesizing things rather. I love that. But one of my favorite pieces of writing is Peggy Nattiello's Passionate Presence. To say it's a nice book sounds like faint praise, but it's just a good book. It's a good book in all ways for me. So I really, really like that book.
Sheila, I'm so glad you said that because it's my favourite person-centered book.
Is it?
It is, yeah. And for people watching, we didn't discuss this beforehand. Yeah. So I completely agree. I think the way it is just outlined, and it just conveys so much in such a gentle kind of a gentle way that it just encapsulates so much, I think, in that text. So I absolutely love it. So
and it encapsulates only people who've had been lucky enough to work with her or be in a group with her, or more recently, or be in Zoom groups with her more recently. It's her as well. It's just so, those of us, you can hear her, and I guess maybe people say that about Roger's writing if they knew him, but for me, everything about that book is just,
wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you now about what's your favourite piece of writing that you've written, and I'm hoping that you've got an answer, unlike the moment that you're proud of the most in your career.
No, I have got an answer for that. It's not an article. or anything like that. But the one of my fave raves, and because it taught me a lot about what writing a paper was. It was the time, I think, maybe I found myself suggesting something. I don't know if this is truth. It was the first time, but for me, first time I found myself suggesting something that wasn't quite in the canon of classical theory. And somebody, Gary Prouty, quoted it one time in his writing. So, and it's, I think it's in the empathy book, in the chapter. Excuse me. And can I read it to you? I've written it out because it's one of it. So it's not that conditions of worth exist. It's that conditions did not exist for worth to develop.
Fantastic. And was that the bit he quoted? Yeah.
And I just remember to this day the feeling when I was trying to do that. I don't find, I'm not sure how many people do. I do not find writing easy. It's absolute. There's always that time. I imagine you feel it too, Peace. Like, why the bloody hell why? You know, what was this? What is my incongruence that forces me to say yes to these things? Because this is madness. But writing that, and that sentence came out, and it was like, oh my God, this is what this paper's about, actually. And everything I've written has led up to that sentence, and everything now follows from that sentence. I don't know that anybody, well, Gary Prouty did. I don't know that anybody else would particularly notice that. But it was just, and it just led me on a whole thing about the problems of congruence and the theory of congruence, and that led me to getting more involved in looking at Gendlin's work. And that you know, for those people who don't know, that many years ago there was a big split, surprise, surprise, in the person-centered community between what was then just called classical, some people were calling it other names without the one, so were pretty uncomplimentary, and experiential. And there was basically, it's a longer story than this, of course. Rogers and Gendlin fell out, and everybody fell out over the Wisconsin thing. And somehow those two lines then went like that. And I'm really sorry for that, because I think whilst I'm not going to work as an experiential psychotherapist, person-centered experiential, the theory of experiencing and Gendlin, how that's been developed, I think is really, really helpful and really useful. So yeah, that one, that's my favourite. And another little favourite, but I'm not so confident of it, was the paper about the problems of congruences, and something like that as an answer in complexity theory. I liked that one. I never thought I'd be writing about something like complexity theory, for God's sakes.
Well, that's what I was thinking about when you were talking, and what I really liked about your writing, and also hearing you talk about theory in different kind of spaces, is you don't just talk about the theory. There is other theories and ideas that you've read about that interlink, and that you try and make those connections across disciplines and approaches, which I think is brilliant. And it kind of, again, it's that opening out, isn't it? Rather than we're all here, we've got to focus on the 6 conditions. Okay, yes, but how do they connect with all these other things that people are talking about?
Yeah, I do like, you know, that recently I did something on online events, and I think I might have done it for us on the CPD program at Metanoia, that the phenomena known of transference. I've really enjoyed that one, because it's just, you know, I mean, I know, you know, I always think these things are obvious to everybody else, that, you know, we're all talking about the same phenomena. And we all describe it differently. I mean, I do get very irritated, excuse me, when somebody says something about transference, and I say, oh, well, you know, I don't actually go with the theory of transference. It's like, well, yes, but sorry, if you ignore transference, then blah, blah, blah. It's like, excuse me, I don't believe in transference. So how can I ignore it? What am I ignoring if I don't believe in it? But I'm really like, you know, what is that phenomena we're all talking about? What you know, for me, my stock phrase is, What are the grains of truth in this? Very rarely do I think someone's picked something up. I mean, sometimes I think it's happened, but not that often. There are grains of truth in what we're thinking about and what we're saying. The trouble is sometimes, myself probably included, we run with that 2 grains of truth rather than actually integrating it and thinking about, what if, and one of my favorite bits is, if we pretended or agreed that the unconscious, as Freud decided it, didn't exist, how do we describe what we see and feel? Just because I decide I don't believe in the unconscious doesn't mean all those things disappear. But how do I describe them? Is there a different way? If I step left or right or front or back and I take in person-centered philosophy, can I describe that phenomena?
And for me, that's some of the exciting work in terms of the person-centered theory is advancing it to kind of say, can we use the person-centered lens to understand some of these other aspects of experience or the therapeutic process or the relationship?
And then we might we can add some grains of truth to the pot, and maybe in 200-300 years we'll have all the truth. But I don't think we will, because it's, well, I mean, we haven't got time for that one. Even I know.
The next 200-300 years, though.
I was just thinking, when everybody gets all depressed about how robots are going to take over and all the rest of it, and I think, when we watch those films, and it's always usually a dystopian future, are we sort of like getting, describing how it might be, or are we actually creating what might be? I don't know that I ever fully understood it, but it was Bohm, I think, who said something like, the question is not how the universe created consciousness, but how consciousness created the universe. And he meant it absolutely concretely. It's like, well, I can start getting freaked out about things like that. It's like, oh no. It's like the Matrix on a good way, in a good way.
It is. I went to see Professor Brian Cox talk in Liverpool, and kind of came out feeling like the smallest thing in the in this expanse of what we call the universe, and really just puts some things in perspective in terms of who we are, where we are, and what we don't know.
Absolutely.
So coming to some of my last questions, but I'm really interested to hear about this, although we've touched maybe a little bit on this as we've had some discussions. So, I mean, you've been in the person-centered community for a long time now. You've known lots of different person-centered therapists and person-centered spaces. I know some people we've lost in recent years from the person-centered community. I was wondering just how you think that I say person-centered community as if it's one thing, but it's probably multiple communities. But how have you seen that kind of change, within the UK and internationally over the years that you've been involved with them?
I mean, the big thing that's happened in my time is the coming together of the experiential and the classical. That's been very nice. That was when my first international conference was one of those. I think now I look back for myself, I say it, one of those naive responses. This is supposed to be person-centered. Why is everybody so angry? And people walking out of presentations and stuff. And now I remember, we're not fully functioning, so we have some incongruence. So that's why we get into stuff, I think. That's a big one. And that's internationally, I think. The other thing that's changed, well, I don't know. I think we're in a bit of a transition in some ways, because you're right, we've lost quite a few people in the last few years, and they were like the next generation from Rogers. I think there's always when it was really clear to me when Rogers died, it seemed like, and I think this has been talking to other people, it's sort of true in quite a lot of approaches, when the main person disappears or dies. And of course, Rogers, as Sally Chisholm, one of our colleagues, is always wanting to make sure we mention, and she's right, Rogers didn't do it all on his own. There was a lot of people around him, a lot of doctorate students feeding into the work. He was the head of it, that's the truth, or he was the forefront, but there was a lot of people. And when he died, I think we all got a bit moribund for 5-10 years. It was all like, I got quite tired, although I understand it a bit more as I get older. I got tired of going to conferences and seeing these people, mostly blokes, mostly white blokes, sitting around plenaries talking about the afternoon they went out with Rogers. And it was such a lovely experience. Now I feel a bit softer about that. They were talking about someone they loved and cared about professionally and personally. So I think we might describe that as a lack of empathy in those days, formed by the fact I'd spent a lot of money trying to get to those conferences. So, I'm not giving myself a hard time for it. And then we seemed to come up forward again. And the people like Bozarth and Peggy and Tony Merry and all that sort of group of people, and Pete Sanders, Paul Wilkins, and Peter Schmidt. I mean, those are the people in particular we've lost. There's others, that I'm remembering right now, but their names possibly people won't know. And so, that sort of like set us back a little bit, I think. But then I also look and I think, now we've got around people like David Murphy, we've got Margaret Warner, we've got some people from the continent starting to write. Maybe I can put myself in there. We've got Janet Tolan around, and I think these are people who are doing really interesting work in the person-centered psychotherapeutic world, theory and practice. We're very different from the continent, though. It's really interesting to me. My partner is Slovak, and he set up when Czechoslovakia, my husband, I should say, it's Czechoslovakia Institute, and worked with Rogers and all this. But the style there is different from the style here. But it was the same initial people: Chuck Devonshire, the guy whose name I forgot on Friday and can't get back into my head, Irish guy who was part of the set up the cross-cultural forums. They were the same group, but the way it's been taken in the different cultures just across Europe. And I don't know if this is true anecdotally. Rogers apparently said after his first trip to the UK that person-centered would never take off in the UK because we were too polite. Now, I think we're just nice a lot of the time. I live in a cross-cultural relationship, so this has been a discussion quite often about how we see the different. That's by the by. So I think at the moment on the continent they seem far more the sweeping generalizations, but more interested in the experiential part of person-centered. Where in this country we seem more interested in the more principled, non-directive side of person-centered. And in America, it's quite classical, but it's not very strong at the moment. It's weak. It does seem, much to my chagrin, it does seem that when these things come out of university systems, we lose ourselves a little bit. In this country, I think we're going through a moment of interesting discussion, rowettes maybe sometimes, in terms of what is person-centered and what isn't. Whether it's a therapy, some approaches that are being called person-centered therapy, whether they are person-centered therapy for me. But I can see them as approaches. I think you could have a person-centered approach to Gestalt therapy, for example, if you wanted. But that's always been the case, isn't it? It's always been that, any of us can call ourselves person-centered insofar as there's general agreement that those 5 therapist conditions are necessary for every therapeutic relationship. Ergo, you're person-centered. But I mean, obviously, I don't believe that means we're person-centered psychotherapists as a modality or an orientation. So I think it's, on a good day, I think, I don't know, let's start with the negative. On a bad day, I can feel like, oh God, some are person-centered, we feel a bit like we're being sidelined again. We keep being told we feel like we're being sidelined. So it's like, oh, maybe I am being, those sorts of things. On a good day, I think it's quite exciting. I mean, it's got to be exciting. And long-term, Peter, I do have this sense that if person-centered psychotherapy, as I understand it and I like to practice it, if it disappears, it will come back in some way, because I think it's this approach that those 6 or the 5 conditions that work. Our only disagreement is whether they're sufficient. So if they're necessary, they will come back. So if I take the very long-term view.
So these next 200-300 years, we did manage to cover it then, didn't we?
Exactly. Yeah.
I was also just thinking in terms of, like, sometimes when you're in something, like if there's conflict and things like that going on, that it can be difficult to see what benefits might come out of that, and sometimes something arises from that anyway.
Absolutely.
So it might be quite difficult at that particular time.
Yeah, well, there were splits in the UK very early on, and that led to the growth of 2 or 3 more institutes. And at that time, that was big news. So so that's how I think that's enough. That's enough. Yeah.
Thank you. So my very final question is, what have you got planned next?
My cunning plan next. As much as I ever plan these things, I know there's a group getting together to create a sort of discussion space that I hope to be a part of. So there's that. Watch this space, or watch the space.
Yeah.
And the other, okay, I don't. Are you old enough to remember the Fast Show? I don't know now. And do you remember the guy who used to come out of the farmyard shed saying, this month I'm concentrating mainly on Versace dresses, something like that. So I feel it a bit like that at the moment. My current bee in a bonnet is about UPR, as I said right at the early on, and I was asked to update a paper for a handbook that will be out at some point next year, I think, on UPR. And what I learned from it and got back into what we were saying before was realizing and I suppose this is an announcement to anybody who's listening, that I don't want to call it UPR anymore. We've for lots and lots of reasons, not particularly relevant in this moment, we have changed the idea of love, compassion, kindness, warmth into an acronym called UPR. And in doing that, I profoundly believe, language begets thinking, begets language, begets attitude or something. And we, myself included, talk about UPR. UPR, yeah, we need empathy, kindness, and UPR. It's like, we need love. Just throw some love in. And so my current bee in the bonnet is, to actually start thinking about UPR. Just done it, but change UPR into just maybe, I don't know, something, but we've got to get back the soul and the humanity of that acronym, basically.
I mean, that's really interesting, because it's that idea is it's turned into like this theoretical term and concept, but anyone can say, well, I've offered UPR, but what does that actually look like in practice with the person that you were sat with?
Yeah.
Does
and what
really
does it
mean
feel
anything?
like?
Yeah. To give it and to receive it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's it.
I mean, I love that, and I look forward to hearing more from you on that particular topic. Sheila, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and doing this interview, but also thank you for everything that you've given to the profession and also the person-centered community, because there is a lot there, and I know a lot of people value your work, and I don't think you always get enough credit for it. So thank you very much for everything that you've done.
Thank you. You're going to make me squishy. Thank you. Thank you.